There was a time when a console error did not politely return you to a dashboard. It did not offer troubleshooting tips. It simply stopped. The music died. The screen changed color. A sentence appeared that you had never seen before, and suddenly the machine beneath your television felt wrong. If you want to uncover the moments when old consoles turned ordinary glitches into something terrifying, subscribe to Cartridge Graveyard. Not broken, possessed. But one infamous PlayStation failure went further. It could twist the startup sound, corrupt the logo, and produce something fans later called fearful harmony. The strange part is that Sony never designed it to frighten you. So what exactly were we seeing? In the 1980s, consoles rarely explained themselves because there was barely a system layer available to do the explaining. If an Atari 2600 cartridge failed, you might get rolling lines, screaming colors, or a frozen mess of sprites. There was no operating system ready to apologize. The hardware simply read bad data, so the television displayed digital soup. The Nintendo Entertainment System made failure more theatrical, but not because Nintendo wanted scarier errors. It wanted tighter control. Push in a dusty cartridge, press power, and the screen might flash gray. The red power light blinked. Your game appeared for half a second, but the console reset before Mario could even take one step. The culprit was often the 10 NES lockout system. A chip inside the console had to communicate with a matching chip in licensed cartridges. If that electronic handshake failed, the NES entered a reset loop. Nintendo intended this to block unlicensed games, but aging connectors and dirty cartridge pins meant it also blocked perfectly legitimate Saturday mornings. So we developed rituals. Remove the cartridge, blow into it, push it down slowly. Tap the side of the machine like you were negotiating with a tiny plastic landlord. Blowing introduced moisture and was not exactly recommended engineering, but try telling that to an 8-year-old who had 5 minutes before breakfast. The NES usually gave you no words because its most recognizable failure was not really a message. It was a security system repeatedly pulling the plug. That mattered. A written warning has boundaries, but a blank flashing screen lets your imagination do the work. But Nintendo's control strategy created a new problem. As consoles expanded across regions and publishers found ways around hardware restrictions, a silent reset was no longer enough. Manufacturers needed the machine to explain which rule had been broken. So by the 16-bit era, consoles had become more talkative because the business had become more complicated. Regions, licensing, copy protection, and add-ons all needed rules. Errors stopped looking like random hardware failure and started sounding like authority figures. The Super Nintendo could display messages explaining that a game pack was not designed for that regional system. Certain games also contained anti-piracy checks. If the software detected suspicious hardware conditions, it could halt with a warning about unauthorized copying devices. But a warning only mattered if the player cared about obeying it. Developers therefore escalated from explaining the rule to punishing anyone who bypassed it. Earthbound became legendary for this. Its protection could increase enemy encounters on an unauthorized copy, making the game brutally annoying. But if a player somehow pushed through, another check could freeze the game near the end and erase the save data. That was not an accident. It was a trap. And that trap reveals something important. Once consoles seemed capable of identifying forbidden hardware, players began imagining that the machine knew far more than it really did. That is where the first mystery creeps in. Search for retro anti-piracy screens today, and you will find distorted faces, blood-red text, dead characters, and messages personally accusing the player of theft. Most are fake. They are modern horror art built around a believable childhood fear. Real anti-piracy systems were usually less cinematic. They froze, reset, deleted progress, or displayed legal text. The fake screens work because they imitate a real feeling. As children, we did not understand what the console knew. If it could detect a copied game, perhaps it could detect us. That uncertainty made the startup sequence valuable. If a console could declare a game legitimate before it even loaded, the manufacturer gained both a security checkpoint and a legal argument. Sega tried to turn that idea into a weapon. This was not really an error screen. It was a legal weapon disguised as a boot message. Sega wanted unlicensed games to trigger its trademark, which could strengthen Sega's case in court. But Accolade reverse-engineered the system, litigation followed, and the strategy did not work as Sega hoped. Genesis does what Nintendo don't, sounded cool in commercials. Genesis performs intellectual property enforcement before loading the ROM, was apparently less catchy, but cartridge security still dealt with one relatively simple question. Could the console communicate with the chip inside the cartridge? The arrival of optical discs made that question far messier. A disk could be scratched, badly mastered, inserted into the wrong device, or partially readable, so failure was no longer just a rejected handshake. It became a machine trying to decide what kind of object you had fed it. That is why CD-based systems changed everything. Put a game disc into a normal audio CD player, and it might try to play the data track as sound. That could produce harsh noise, so developers began adding warning tracks. The message was not decoration. It existed because the same physical disc could be interpreted by two completely different machines, and one interpretation sounded like electronics screaming. Some warnings were calm. Others sounded oddly personal. A voice might tell you that the disc belonged in a game console and should be removed immediately. The message was practical, but hearing a hidden human voice from a game disc felt like discovering a sealed room inside your house. The Sega CD also had a system screen asking for a disc, complete with floating graphics and that wonderfully early 1990s vision of the future. But the more elaborate the interface became, the more visible failure became with it. If the hardware could not read your game, the colorful interface turned into a waiting room. You cleaned the disc. The laser clicked. Nothing happened. That clicking sound was the real horror because optical media had introduced a moving part that could wear out. A failed cartridge often suggested dirt. A failed disc could suggest a dying laser. And a dying laser usually meant money. But optical media created another consequence. Because the console now had to inspect and identify the disc before launching it, the boot sequence became a ritual of verification. Sony understood how to make that ritual feel enormous, so when verification failed, the atmosphere collapsed with it. The original PlayStation launched in Japan on December 3, 1994. Its startup was already unusual. A white screen appeared with the Sony Computer Entertainment logo, accompanied by a deep, metallic swell. The console checked its hardware and began reading the disc. A black screen followed. The colored PlayStation logo appeared, and a crystalline sound confirmed that valid PlayStation software had been recognized. It lasted only seconds, but it felt enormous, like opening the doors to some digital cathedral. That drama made failure hit harder. If the console could not recognize the disc as PlayStation software, it might send you to the CD player or memory card menu. In other cases, the startup could stall. The logo might appear incomplete. The sound might stretch, repeat, or collapse into noise. Players later gave several corrupted boot sequences names such as Personified Fear and Fearful Harmony. In the most famous examples, the Sony logo appears against darkness while the audio becomes a warped mechanical drone. Sometimes the image is damaged, sometimes the sound continues far longer than it should. Watch it alone at night, and it feels intentional. It feels like a secret screen placed inside the BIOS by an exhausted Sony engineer who hated children. But here is what makes it more disturbing. There is no single official Fearful Harmony screen. The name came from the community. The effect can vary because it is not one neatly scripted message. It is the console's normal startup process breaking in unusual ways. A damaged, poorly mastered, modified, or incorrectly read disc can make the system behave unpredictably as it attempts to identify valid software. Emulation, disk swaps, hardware faults, and corrupted data can produce different results too. So Fearful Harmony is not a monster hidden inside every PlayStation. It is a family of failures. The console is trying to perform something familiar, but the information arrives damaged. The timing breaks. Audio data becomes mangled. The reassuring ritual loses its shape. That is why it feels uncanny. 8S/ You know every note of the normal boot sound. So one wrong tone is enough to make the room feel colder. Sony could have made its next console less dramatic. But the PlayStation startup had proved that a boot sequence could establish the entire personality of a machine within seconds. So instead of removing the atmosphere, Sony intensified it. And that meant failure became deliberate theater. The PlayStation 2 launched in Japan on March 4, 2000, and its normal startup showed abstract towers in a dark blue space. Those towers were linked to data on your memory card, so even the boot sequence felt mysterious and personal. But insert an unreadable or invalid disc and you could meet the red screen of death. The calm blue environment turned red. The camera moved through a hostile wall of geometric blocks. A low, grinding sound played. That sentence is painfully ordinary. The presentation is not. Sony could have used a plain menu. Instead, the PS2 reacted like you had inserted a cursed object. The error became infamous because it combined three fears at once. The disc might be ruined. The laser might be dying. The console might know you had tried something you should not have tried. But red did not automatically mean piracy. A scratched legitimate game, the wrong disc format, a weak laser, or a failed read could trigger it. The machine was not judging you. It was just spectacularly bad at bedside manner. That theatrical approach was memorable, but it was terrible diagnostics. As consoles grew more complex, manufacturers could no longer rely on one ominous screen to represent dozens of possible failures. Players needed to know whether the problem was the disk, the drive, the hard drive, or the console itself, so other systems leaned toward more practical warnings. The Dreamcast might return you to its system menu if it failed to recognize a disk. 8's The GameCube displayed a black screen telling you to turn off the power and consult the instruction booklet. The original Xbox showed a multilingual service screen with a numeric error code when a critical component failed. These were more informative, but not necessarily less scary. The Xbox screen looked like a hospital monitor for a machine that had already flatlined. The little error number was useful if you knew what it meant. To everyone else, it was a bill waiting to happen. Modern systems explain more because they are always running an interface beneath the game. They can identify network failures, corrupted installations, overheated hardware, and missing updates. That is better. Nobody misses losing a save because the machine decided silence was an acceptable diagnostic tool. But that improvement came at a cost. Old consoles had strong, predictable rituals because there was almost nothing between the player and the hardware. A cartridge clicked into place. A disc spun up. A logo appeared. A specific sound told you everything was safe. So when one part changed, you noticed instantly. That closes the mystery behind Fearful Harmony and nearly every terrifying retro error screen. The machine was not revealing a hidden personality. It was losing the carefully designed mask that normally concealed its machinery. For one uncomfortable moment, you saw the console not as Nintendo, Sega, or PlayStation, but as chips, timing signals, damaged data, and failing mechanical parts desperately trying to agree. The horror was never that the console understood what you had done. The horror was that it understood nothing at all. Yet those broken screens stayed with us because they interrupted places we trusted. They turned bedrooms into dark arcades, familiar jingles into warning sirens, and harmless plastic boxes into mysteries we still talk about decades later. Which retro console error scared you the most, and did you ever discover what caused it? Share your story in the comments, and if you enjoy uncovering the strange history hiding inside old hardware, consider liking the video and subscribing. You'll be glad you did.